This autumn on 2, enjoy the high life in the Europe of the 20s with a BBC adaptation of Tender is the Night.
Come on, Nicole, what did you buy?
Oh, nothing much, darling.
Merci,
No,
monsieur.
jewels? Oh, well, just a few beads and baubles, you know. Oh, and things, you know, like a rubber alligator.
Oh, goody, 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 goody. I prefer rubber teeth.
Oh, isn't it wonderful to be in Paris? We'll have fun, won't we? Lots of fun.
Loads of fun.
Nicole, isn't it a lonely life owning me?
It irritates you, my need for attention all the time. I never let you out of my hair, because if I did, I would...
Nicole, if you insist on making me your keeper,
Oh, I do.
let me look after a bright Nicole. Let there be gay.
Tender is the Night, a classic love story for the autumn on BBC Two.
On BBC One, in about 3 minutes, David Attenborough begins a new series of Wildlife on One, introducing his audience to the mantis shrimp. Here on 2, our health and food campaign continues now, as Dr. Michael O'Donnell investigates the post-war decline of the British diet and asks, where did we go wrong?
Here in the heart of Britain's cattle and dairy country nestles the annual three-county show. I'm surrounded here by stands and marquees promoting one of Britain's greatest industries, agriculture. Yet this sort of celebration seems slightly misplaced in the 1980s because the emphasis here is still very much on dairy farming, with pigs perhaps coming a close second. Now, this emphasis on dairy farming is one of the legacies that is pushing our diet in an unhealthy direction. The average British diet gets nearly a fifth of its calories from saturated fat. The fats we've already shown in the series are linked to heart disease, and the same fats produced in huge quantities by the dairy and cattle farmers. Dairy products and intensively reared meat are the country's main sources of saturated fat. We've clearly inherited an agricultural legacy that is out of tune with the needs of the 1980s. Until recently, all nutritional advice was aimed at countering undernutrition, and agricultural policy developed alongside this. In British agriculture, the cow is still sacred. And this is something that's going to have to change if we're going to cut down the amount of fat in the nation's diet. How did we get into a position where we're producing food which is helping to make us the world's #1 for heart disease? It has to be said that having enough food at a price everyone can afford is a big improvement on the malnutrition which afflicted many poor people in Britain right up to the Second World War. The British diet began to go wrong at the start of the Industrial Revolution, for it was then that large numbers of people moved from the country to the new industrial towns. The new urban dwellers ate fewer vegetables and started to eat much more refined food, especially white flour and white sugar, which in those days were associated with refined living. Now, the real sugar bonanza started only 100 years ago, when in order to help the colonies, the tariff on sugar was cut and clean, cheap sugar became available to the English working classes. And they did need it then because the rest of their diet was so short of calories. In those days, they might well have a sugar loaf in their kitchen, and they would eat sugar not just in syrup and treacle or in jam, but they would put lard or dripping onto bread like this, and then sprinkle sugar over it, probably to take the taste of the lard away. Now, by the end of the century, there was a lot of concern about the health of the self-same working classes. 40% of the people who volunteered for the Boer War were turned down on grounds of physical ill health. And a special committee was set up to examine what was rather quaintly called physical deterioration. And physical deterioration of the masses was found to be due to their poor diet. Eating too little rather than too much worried scientists throughout the early part of this century. As late as 1935, some leading nutritionists made a film about the problem of lack of food for the poor.
The diet really adequate for health is eaten by barely half the community, while that of the poorest class, numbering at least 4.5 million people, is deficient in every constituent. These countrywide conclusions are supported by many local surveys. Investigators have gone into the homes of all classes of the people and obtained from them exact information on the food they are able to buy and the money they spend on it.
And now, Mrs. Seabright, I see you're 5 in family, and you've got 4 shillings a week to spend for each of you on food. Do you find you can feed your family well enough on that?
No, not very well. It's rather difficult at times. Of course, in the winter it was more difficult with coal, etc., being expensive, and I've seen my husband and myself going rather short sometimes to give the children at dinner. Towards the end of the week, of course. We've had bread and jam or bread and margarine and a cup of tea.
These 6 men represent our 6 income groups. Here we've marked a level of adequacy. That is, the consumption of calcium necessary for perfect health. The people in the highest group get enough. Consumption falls away rapidly until only a tiny percentage of the standard requirement is satisfied in the 4 shillings group. And remember that
These worries about calcium were a powerful argument for increasing milk production.
nutrition is bound to play an important part in the national policy of this country. Many government departments are directly concerned with it. An example of government policy is to be found in the activities of the Milk Marketing Board. By means of subsidies and the control of milk production, the consumption of milk was last year increased by 78.5 million gallons. 2 3/4 million school children receive daily rations of milk at a specially reduced price of a halfpenny for 1/3 of a pint. Here is Mr. Walter Elliott at an elementary school on the first day of the cheap milk in schools scheme. The great municipal bodies...
The emphasis by scientists and government officials on milk and other dairy products was to have serious repercussions for a much more affluent Britain a generation later. But in between came an event which had a profound and very different effect on the nation's diet and the nation's health.
There wasn't any shooting, but this ordinary shopping street has been the scene of a revolution, a social revolution caused by the war, which has changed the buying habits, and therefore the living habits, of the British people as drastically as bombs changed their towns.
During the Second World War, despite how it felt at the time, the nation was better fed in terms of health than it is today. The British government believed that victory depended on a well-fed population.
They rationed all basic foods except bread and vegetables. They controlled prices strictly. It put the $1-a-day man on an eating level with a $1-a-year man. Their basic rations don't amount to much, but they are sure of getting them every week. Half a pound of butter.
For the first time, the country had a national food policy, and with that policy came a propaganda campaign which was a model of its kind.
A pound of margarine.
The messages were put to the public with great dramatic effect, from radio chats to leaflets to films like this.
You cannot eat lilies, but You can make sure of greens for next winter if you plan your sowing now. This Ministry of Agriculture leaflet tells you how.
The ration diet we were forced to adopt both during and after the war was remarkably like the diet we're recommending now for better health. Less meat and dairy products and more vegetables and bread. During the war, bread wasn't rationed. High-fibre cereals and pulses were promoted alongside the national loaf, which itself was made with whole grain flour, so retaining much of the goodness not found in white bread. Food rationing continued long after the war, and for the first time, even bread was rationed. For the housewives of Britain, this was the final blow after what they regarded as years of deprivation.
Housewives pack in to hear Vicar's wife and food crusader Mrs. Lovelock fire the opening shots in the Stop the Bread Cuts battle.
We, the housewives of Great Britain, are in open revolt against bread rationing. The rich people will not suffer. It's the middle class, the poor people, the people with children. They're the ones that's going to suffer. It's bread for breakfast, bread for dinner, bread for tea for them, and therefore we, the British Housewives League, will not stand for bread rationing.
That was Mrs. Lovelock, and this is one of the 2,000 extra civil servants for bread control. And this is the ration card itself. Take a good look. You're going to see it each day and every day for at least a year. Watch out, this doesn't go under the counter.
For the poorest people in Britain, the war represented a time of plenty in terms of food, which was rationed by points and not by wealth. For the rest of Britain, rationing had an unexpected bonus. One man who worked in the Ministry of Food during the war years is nutrition expert Dr. Hugh Sinclair.
We had a superb policy then, and Britain, despite rationing, was very well fed. Now, the deaths from coronary heart disease during the war are very interesting because they fell dramatically in all Western countries for which there are figures immediately as the war started. So this is nothing to do with the furring up of arteries, which is a chronic process. It's to do with the clotting or thrombosis in blood, which is rapidly affected by the different fats in the diet. And a very interesting point was that in late 1941, we had lease lend from America. We got large amounts, mainly of three foods, of very fat bacon, which is saturated fat, of hydrogenated margarine, which is a saturated fat, and of a curious food called spam, all three saturated fats. So suddenly, our intake of saturated fat increased dramatically. And before the end of the war, in 1943, our deaths from heart disease rose, whereas in other European countries, they only increased immediately the war was over.
When the war ended, so did Britain's first and only food and health policy. And when rationing finally ended in the early 1950s, it was generally accepted that if people were eating enough, they were sufficiently well fed. The end of rationing was seen as a return to the good times. Suddenly, Britain became a nation of plenty. New styles of restaurants opened to popular acclaim. It took nutritionists and doctors another 30 years to realize that too much of the wrong food can be as damaging as too little. A nutritional theory in this century grew up in response to the problem of undernutrition and not to today's problem of overconsumption. And because of this, the idea developed that the key to a healthy diet was protein, particularly animal protein. And after the Second World War, farmers were encouraged to produce more and more fatty meat and dairy products to make sure we all had enough protein. Animal protein was given a further boost when it appeared that malnutrition diseases in famine parts of Africa were due to lack of protein. The idea arose because American surplus skimmed milk powder was an effective treatment. We now know that shortage of food in general causes these diseases and that protein requirements were overestimated. Nevertheless, this mistaken belief that animal protein was best helped the cow to become sacred in British farming. What effect has this nutritional emphasis had on our attitude to food? I asked food writer Geoffrey Cannon.
Oh, it's affected our beliefs profoundly. I mean, I was born in 1940, and therefore I was born as a post-30s baby. And I was brought up to believe that milk was good. And I found it very difficult to accept the idea that there was anything wrong with milk. Then, looking back into history, the reason for this is because two of the problems in the 30s were lack of protein and lack of calcium, which is obviously superbly provided by full-fat milk, incidentally also perfectly well provided by skim milk as well. And so the idea was implanted that dairy produce was good, extremely good food. But more than that, there was, of course, a government campaign by which means the government moved the whole food and farming industry towards dairy farming, so that now the farming industry, nationally and internationally, is geared towards a kind of food which is now understood, because science is better now, is now understood to be not good for health. So yes, I mean, our whole idea about what good food is actually goes back to the great experiment of the 30s and during the war, when people were bought out of a sort of semi-third world state of malnutrition, or the working classes rather, which was good. And we now face new problems, but are not solving them.
These problems are a diet that's too high in saturated fat from all the animal protein we eat, and as well as this, a diet that's too low in fibre, because since the 1950s, we've been eating more refined, convenience foods. Why has there been this unhealthy shift to so much refined food?
Well, the impact of highly processed food is calamitous. What's happening is not, of course, that the food manufacturers are deliberately trying to poison the population. Naturally not. The problem is, in a phrase, good food goes bad. Or to put it another way, it's perishable food that has the greatest nutritive value in it. Whereas food manufacturers are bound inevitably to go for food which is a good commodity, as distinct from a good food, food that packs well, that travels well, that's compact, and so forth. So that there is an inevitable clash between health and wealth, as far as food is concerned. There again, as time goes on now, food manufacturers are becoming more and more capital intensive. There's much less human care taken on food. To give an obvious example, it's much easier to make plastic bread, the white bread that most people eat by machine, than it is to make wholemeal bread. It's a trickier process. It requires more human care.
Machine-age bread began in the 1880s. Bakeries started using highly refined white flour made by new steel rolling mills. One of the few people to react against refined foods was a London doctor, Thomas Allinson. He campaigned to keep the nation eating bread made with wholemeal flour. His threepenny booklet was a big seller, but his campaigning made him unpopular with doctors of the time. He was struck off the medical register for advertising his ideas on food and health. And after losing an appeal to the Privy Council, Dr. Allinson began to manufacture the food he had preached about and started the Natural Food Company. Bakers were given testimonials of approval from Dr. Allinson. These were the same recommendations we're now getting from expert committees. If the English people only knew the immense value of wholemeal bread as a preserver of health, they'd make it a regular article of diet. He claimed wholemeal bread was the best cure for constipation, with its attendant evils of piles and varicose veins. 100 years on, The NACME report says we should eat more fibre. Today's high priest of fibre is Dr. Dennis Burkitt.
Now, we didn't know what fibre was until about less than 20 years ago. We didn't know what it did. We didn't know how to measure it. Now there's an enormous amount of work done on fibre, and we realize it is strongly protective against a great deal of our modern Western disease. Now, I'm not talking about rare diseases. I'm talking about coronary heart disease, the commonest cause of death in the West. Large bowel cancer, the second commonest cancer death after lung cancer. Appendicitis, the commonest abdominal emergency. Gallstones, the commonest abdominal operation. Obesity, the commonest nutritional disorder. Diabetes, the commonest endocrine disorder. Varicose veins and hemorrhoids, the commonest venous disorders, and so one could go on. So it's an enormous amount of our disease load must be preventable. Now, many of the diseases I've listed are directly related to constipation, and the only common cause for constipation is the removal of fibre from our diet. I mean, bowel cancer, diverticular disease, appendicitis, hemorrhoids, and so on are largely the result of constipation. Now, fibre has other properties. It has profound effects on cholesterol metabolism. And without going into detail, most people recognize that both gallstones and coronary heart disease are related to the mechanisms of cholesterol in our system. It also alters the rate at which we absorb food. If we have a fiber-depleted diet, the energy is very quickly absorbed from our gut. If we have a high fiber diet, it's absorbed very slowly, and this is how fiber protects against diabetes. One could go on from disease to disease, and it has a profound effect on the bacteria of our gut. And the bacteria of our gut, we're just beginning to realize, are extraordinarily important from the point of view of our health.
One reason we've reached this crisis with British food is that these changes in our diet have taken place gradually over a long time, and their effects have been masked by other changes, improvements in our health, improvements in our health services. I mean, in my lifetime as a doctor, I've seen the virtual disappearance of acute infectious diseases like tuberculosis, polio, diphtheria. But these diseases have now been replaced by more insidious, drawn-out diseases like coronary heart disease and cancer. In Britain, it's taken more than a century for our diet to change, and with it our disease pattern. But on a small island in the Pacific, the switch from healthy, unrefined food to a Western-style diet came very suddenly. Nauru used to be no different from all other Polynesian islands. It survived on a small-scale economy based on agriculture and fishing, but it was found to be rich in phosphate, the result of millions of years of bird droppings. The Nauru people fast became the second most wealthy in the world, with a higher income per head than the Americans. With this sudden wealth came a sudden change in lifestyle, especially in food. Western-type food and soft drinks became readily available. Their calorie intake more than doubled to a staggering 7,000 calories a day. This revolution in eating habits, which has taken more than a century in Britain, has taken less than 20 years in Nauru. The sad tale of this island is of great interest to nutrition experts like Dr. Burkitt.
Now, I'll take one disease, diabetes. In a recent survey done by Professor Zimmert, 41% of the whole population of Nauru, male and female, over the age of 20, were found to be diabetics. Now, they've learned to get appendicitis and obesity. They come into the early classes of Western culture. They won't get gallstones or coronary heart disease for another 20 years. Their grandchildren will get diverticular disease, hiatus hernia, bowel cancer, and so on. So that's the pattern we've seen in other countries.
The changes in Nauru came quickly. In other places, such as Africa, they are happening much more slowly. In Tanzania, away from the drought-stricken areas of the north of Africa, the eating patterns of rural villagers remain unchanged. Their diet is high in fibre, low in sugar, and low in saturated fat, all the things now being recommended for healthier eating in Britain. For these Africans, food is plentiful and healthy. But for more affluent people living in the cities, Western-style food habits are creeping in. 10 years ago, there was no coronary heart disease amongst Africans in the Tanzanian capital of Dar es Salaam. Here at the city's main hospital, I met consultant cardiologist Dr. Umtalia and asked him if the gradual change to Western-style food was beginning to take its toll.
Yes, basically, coronary arterial disease is not very common. But my experience in the last 10 years is that it's on the increase, particularly in our black populations.
What sort of patients are they who get coronary heart disease now?
These are mostly affluent people in high executive positions in the government and business. And in just a simple example, we have people who have got all the risk factors for coronaries, like obesity, like heavy smoking, and high blood pressure.
How does their diet change when they become more affluent?
This is the eating of, first of all, a lot of food, more refined carbohydrates, eating of saturated fats in the form of creameries and butter. And on the other hand, they are also taking a lot of smoking. And therefore, the weight, smoking, and also we have high rates of hypertension in this country. All these build up.
In the West, too, the evidence on food and health is building up. A succession of reports all call for changes in our eating habits to help reduce the incidence of many common diseases. But if these changes are to be made, major public health measures are needed to implement them. Of course, there are some people, some of them in positions of great influence, who say, well, all this evidence is all very well, but we must have absolute proof. Yet in the past, major public health measures have been undertaken on much less evidence than we now have about food. One thing's certain, that changing our diet and the direction that's being recommended isn't going to do us any harm. We'd be eating the food that's now eaten by most people in the world. And changing our diet so that we eat less fat, eat less sugar, eat more fibre, could have enormous benefits. In the past, a change in food, based on much less evidence than we have now, had dramatic effects. One such change, 200 years ago, had a profound effect on our naval history.
There was a man in charge of the medical services in the British Navy called Gilbert Blaine. And he looked back in his mind and he thought of the work of James Lind 25 years earlier. And Lind had said that in his observations, if you gave sailors at sea fresh fruit or vegetables, it prevented them getting scurvy. So Blaine insisted that lime juice should be added to the rations of all ships in Her Majesty's Navy. Now this simple measure, I suppose a few pounds a ship, saved more casualties than had previously been attributable to all other diseases, all battle casualties, and all shipwrecks, and effectively doubled the fighting force of the Navy. Now, I can hear some of the perhaps scientists of the day, they would have said, Gilbert, my dear chap, you mustn't be all in a rush putting lime juice in the Navy. You don't even know what the factor is that it prevents them from having scurvy. You don't know nearly enough yet. I should hold your horses until you do some more studies. Now, it wasn't until over 180 years later, in 1932, that vitamin C was identified as the factor which prevented men getting scurvy. You see, if people had waited till they understood it, people would have died of scurvy for another 180 years. We must be very careful before we advise things that we have really good evidence. But we don't always have to have absolute proof or absolute understanding.
In his final investigation tomorrow evening at 7:30, Dr. Michael O'Donnell looks at the ingredients that now make us an overweight nation. And the BBC Food and Health Campaign will shortly be producing a free information pack. And to order a copy, please send a large, self-addressed envelope stamped with 24 pence postage to Healthy Eating, BBC Television, London W12 8QT. And viewers in Scotland should either write to Network, Glasgow, G12 9JQ, or phone Glasgow, that's 041 35